I put this video off long enough. This is the thrash metal Iceberg. I'm gonna waste no time explaining how this template works, as I've done quite a handful already on this channel, and the fact that there are probably more Iceberg charts being made on the internet than actual icebergs on this planet, which I know is a running joke whenever this template's brought up, but that's becoming more and more depressing when I think about it. But anyway, with this iceberg chart, there will be 7 tiers, and like always, gotta put out this disclaimer, the whole point is to not name every single thrash metal band. It's to put them in my own terms of categories as I see fit for them, and flesh out the bands that I think fit it perfectly. So if there's anything being missed, which surely there will be, even though I'm including nearly 100 bands in this video, you need to fill in the gaps as to what you think I'm missing out on. So, like always with every iceberg chart, we start at tier number 1, which is just simply titled Big Thrash. I'm not going to waste too much time discussing any of the bands in this particular tier, because I feel like for anyone who gets into thrash metal or knows what thrash metal is, by default you'll just see these bands being talked about non-stop. So getting the obvious ones out of the way first, that being Metallica, Megadeth, Slayer, Anthrax, all famously known for being a part of the Big Four of thrash metal. Then there's all of the Bay Area thrash metal bands, which is a term used when talking about thrash metal bands from the San Francisco area, such as Exodus, Testament, Death Angel, Forbidden, Heathen, and Violence. Other noticeable names that need mentioning but aren't a part of the Bay Area thrash metal scene but still in this country of the United States would be Nuclear Assault, Sacred Reich, and Dark Angel. The only other country in terms of at least popularity and recognizability that I feel like goes at least toe-to-toe with the American thrash scene would obviously be the German thrash scene. So again, more cliche picks would be Sodom, Creator, Destruction, and Tank Guard. And a couple of other names I'll include from the German thrash scene that I feel like gets kind of swept under the rug but still recognizable names would be Exhumer, Assassin, and Onslaught, which I gotta say, out of everything in tier 1, Onslaught is easily, I would consider, the heaviest of everything in this tier. And the last inclusion for tier 1 will go to Motorhead, which I know Lemmy has always considered it rock and roll music, while the fans deemed it as a mixture between metal and punk music. But make no mistake about it, the conversation when discussing the genres that Motorhead played around with typically falls under either thrash metal or speed metal, which yes, later on in this video, speed metal will be a part of the conversation very soon. But I feel like it's important for me at least to include Motorhead in this video just simply because the inspiration and influence they have on every band I've talked about thus far, and more than likely will talk about for the rest of this video, is substantial. So I feel like it would be a crime not to include Motorhead in this. Moving down one tier, we reach tier number 2, which is Crossover Thrash. The title for this tier is pretty self-explanatory. This is all of the crossover thrash bands that will be included in this part. And from my understanding of thrash metal, it's a mixture between traditional heavy metal and hardcore punk and other styles of punk music merged together. But since it's considered thrash metal, I've always looked at it that it's 75% metal and 25% punk. Where crossover thrash, now it's kind of evened out more 50-50 in terms of the influences of traditional heavy metal and hardcore punk. And even in some circumstances with some of these bands, they tend to lean a little bit more on the hardcore punk influence while still having at least a little bit of a grasp on the traditional heavy metal influence. One particular band that made quite a name for themselves with this style of music all the way back in 1983 would be Suicidal Tendencies. When you listen to their debut full-length album, it lays out the blueprints for what this style of music was going to become. And while, yes, there were other thrash metal bands during this time in 1983, Suicidal Tendencies really wanted it to be known that they had a lot of hardcore punk influences, and I feel like, again, for this style of music, crossover thrash, Suicidal Tendencies is probably the most recognizable name. And of course, if I'm going to include Suicidal Tendencies, the very next band that needs to be brought up is DRI, Dirty Rotten Imbeciles, that, just like Suicidal Tendencies, are considered to be the godfathers of crossover thrash. Although I will admit, the sound of DRI, I would argue, they lean a little bit more on the hardcore punk influence. But again, when it comes to this style of music, I think the two big faces are both Suicidal Tendencies and DRI. Then of course there's SOD, which stands for Stormtroopers of Death. Originally this was a side project to the guitarist of Anthrax, that being Scott Ian. And in terms of songwriting, this band has a lot more of a humorous, tongue-in-cheek attitude with how they create music. And after this band disbanded, I believe in 1986, the vocalist for Stormtroopers of Death started a new band called MOD, which is Method of Destruction, and basically carries out the same formula onto them. Irax is another crossover thrash metal band with elements of speed metal sprinkled in terms of their formula, but the real selling point for me is the vocalist, Ketan Penna, which has some phenomenal singing on any album you check out in their discography. I also included Cryptic Slaughter. Their debut full-length album, Convicted, is arguably the most aggressive sounding crossover thrash album in this tier, as well as Cro-Mags, which probably out of everything in this tier, Cro-Mags is the most punk influenced out of everything being said. But because of that, a lot of bands I feel like that kind of deemed as like metallic hardcore bands that are like punk bands that really want more of like that metal sense tend to be influenced by them, that they're a very substantial name within crossover thrash. And the last inclusion for tier number 2 will be Carnivore, mainly known because this was the thrash band for Peter Steele, who's famously known for being in Typo Negative. That just like Stormtroopers of Death, the lyrics are pretty, against the grain and norms of what we consider to be, I guess, politically correct. And I feel like because of that, it's kind of attracted a new crowd that kind of wants this style of like this edgy, tongue-in-cheek attitude with their music. I've noticed in a lot of comment threads. Regardless, it's a very respected album and that's really cherished and loved within, again, the thrash scene, that I feel like anyone who knows crossover thrash or just thrash metal as a whole should already know of this. Moving down another level, we have reached tier 3, which I titled Millennium Thrash. So everything I'm going to be talking about in this particular tier aren't really bands doing anything different from the previous 2 tiers I've talked about thus far, other than the fact that all these bands are formed past the year 2000, that they're basically carrying the torch for the next generation. Such noticeable names would be Havoc, Evil, Warbringer, Toxic Holocaust, and Municipal Waste. And speaking of which, since I'm bringing those guys up, I might as well also include Iron Reagan, which is basically Municipal Waste, as it has half of the members, only there's more of a hardcore punk influence, and lyrical themes have to do more so less with partying and more so to do with political distress. Along with Biocancer, Bonded by Blood, Enforced, which, by the way, I've seen quite a handful of people hype up their latest album, and from what I've heard, it's really solid stuff, again, of the mixture of thrash metal with that crossover influence. Then you got Lost Society, which I'm not really sure if I should include these guys because they started out as a thrash metal band, but surprisingly have changed their style completely with their latest album to metalcore, and not many people are thrilled with it. So I guess, again, we can still include Lost Society, but it's all of their old material is what counts. Gamma Ray and Lich King are two more inclusions in this tier that are obviously formed past the year 2000, that the real big selling point is that they have a lot more of a satirical and humorous take with their lyrics, which I'm starting to notice now with thrash metal. The more I kind of like dive into it left and right, that a lot of bands tend to play around with humorous lyrical themes. I wonder if that just solely has to do with the fact, again, of that punk influence, or they really utilize a lot more lyrics with each song. But again, if you want more of a tongue-in-cheek, lowbrow, and humorous take on thrash metal, definitely check out Lich King and Gamma Ray, as they're all about that attitude. And the final inclusion for Tier 3 will go to Power Trip, which I know this band went through quite the heavy loss back in 2020 when sadly their vocalist Riley Gale passed away, unfortunately. But what makes this band, I feel like, really important as a whole is that from what I noticed is they appealed a lot to a younger demographic in the metal scene, which I think showcases that thrash metal as a whole, where a lot of people think it's a very outdated style of music, that its heyday was back in the 80s, can still appeal to a new generation. And I think that's what Power Trip showcased to everyone with the music they released. Reaching the midway point in this Iceberg chart is tier number 4, that being Adrenaline Thrash. Everything in this tier is going to be all of the speed metal bands. And when it comes to the conversation between speed metal and thrash metal and the differences between the two, you're honestly really splitting hairs. But again, from what I understand of thrash metal, it's a mixture between traditional heavy metal and punk, where it's kind of like 75% metal and 25% punk makes up thrash metal. Where speed metal is you basically take thrash metal and really diminish all of the punk influence to the point that it's just basically thrash metal but just no punk influences. Basically what speed metal is as a whole, and I just think musically and stylistically they share a lot of characteristics together that I feel like it was necessary to just have like one specific tier just for the speed metal bands. One important band to start off this particular tier that I know this might be a hot take because some people consider it the first black metal band, but nonetheless we need to include them, that being Venom. Make no mistake about it, from day one they always had a strong speed metal influence, mainly because they were influenced by Motorhead. And yes, while you can argue that they had a lot of, at least during their time, ideas that resemble what black metal was going to be in that kind of like proto-esque vein, I still feel like it's important for just like what they were doing during the very early 80s. Venom played a huge part in terms of like getting the ball rolling for speed metal. Another early name for speed metal would go to Exciter, which Heavy Metal Maniac is such a killer album, but the thing that impresses me the most about this band as a whole is not only how everything's just played so well, the fact that the vocalist also plays the drums at the same time is just overall not musically impressive, but also physically impressive, that he's able to play at that speed while still unleashing those savage and just super energetic screams and yells that you would find in this style of music. Overall, it's a classic, and again, anyone who knows speed metal should obviously know of this. Also, I had to include Razor, as they're one of the top guns when it comes to Canadian speed metal, along with Whiplash and the band Agent Steel, which I love that name so much for a band. Agent Steel is probably the most like 80s uber macho cheesemo band name I've ever heard, and I love everything about it, as simplistic as it is. I'd also like to include Blind Guardian, most specifically their early albums, one being Follow the Blind, which I know nowadays they're considered to be a power metal band and quite the heavy force in terms of influence on the style of music, yes, but their early albums were more speed metal focused. And I wanted to include them even though they're widely known, just simply because their album Follow the Blind has the song Valhalla, which is probably the most anthemic speed metal song you can find. And speaking of which, since I'm including Blind Guardian, I might as well also include Halloween, which I know, again, nowadays they're more considered to be a more power metal focused band. But again, early albums, especially in the late 80s, they had a strong speed metal influence that, again, needs to be mentioned, I feel like, in this video. But if you're interested in more bands that blend those styles of music together, that being power and speed metal together, strongly recommend you check out the debut full-length album by Savage Grace, Master of Disguise. This album from start to finish is such a banger that it reminds me a little bit of Spinal Tap, but everything is just played faster and more powerful sounding. And I don't know if it's just the songwriting or the guitar riffs or just their very sleazy attitude they have with their presentation, but I just can never seem to get sick of this album. And speaking of which, if you want even more stuff similar to Savage Grace, then strongly recommend you check out Nasty Savage and Metal Lucifer, that in terms of characteristics and style, again, is very similar to it. Showcasing my bias, but I feel like I need to include Running Wild. Everything they did in the 80s, I feel like, is just flawless. Again, they are a mixture of speed metal, yes, but they're mostly known as a traditional heavy metal band that blends power metal together. But again, because of that influence of speed metal, I feel like they do count and they need to be included. And obviously, since I'm including Running Wild, then I need to include the band that's heavily influenced by them, that being Blazing Stone, which is pretty on the nose of inspiration when you consider the fact that their band name is identical to that of the album Blazing Stone by Running Wild. But basically, Blazing Stone is just carrying the spirit and momentum of what you heard in the 80s of Running Wild to present day. So if you enjoy Running Wild, I don't see any reason as to why you can't enjoy Blazing Stone. Concluding tier 4 will be two newer speed metal bands. One of them being Vulture. Their debut full-length album, The Guillotine, is just so infectious to listen to. Super high energy, riffs galore that never seem to fade away any of their energy or ass-kicking power. It is just an album that I feel like is made for people who enjoy, again, you know, all the bands from the past that want to carry that style to present day. Vulture's The Guillotine is just loads of fun. And I'd also like to include Ranger, which again is kind of done in the same vein. The only difference I notice is that their vocals are insanely high pitched, but the energy matches up with it. And again, if you want more speed metal of at least present day now going, definitely check out either Vulture or Ranger. Once again, we move down another level in this Iceberg chart to tier number 5, which is Extreme Thrash. This particular portion is going to consist of all thrash bands that blend, obviously, extreme forms of music together, such as either thrash metal and death metal, that being death thrash, or thrash metal and black metal. And while for extreme metal fans, all the bands I'm going to be talking about here aren't anything, you know, you aren't used to hearing, I feel like for thrash metal fans, you're really now ramping up the velocity and intensity of this sound, especially if you're more familiar with stuff in the first half portion of this video. Kicking off this tier might be kind of a bit of a hot take on my behalf, but I want to include all of these bands mainly because I never included them in any other Iceberg chart. But that's going to be Bathory, Hellhammer, Sarcophago, and Sabbat, which I know all of these bands are considered to be like the forefathers and pioneers to that of black metal, yes. However, when it comes to first wave black metal, really anything that was deemed as black metal in the 80s, a humongous portion of influence they took was thrash metal. Again, that's why it was kind of considered proto-black metal. So, while, yeah, it's kind of a hot take to say these are black metal bands, what are they doing in a thrash metal Iceberg? I feel like for the terms of extreme thrash and for what they did and the influences they took, I feel like I had to include them for kind of like the opening portion of this tier. Another name that's just as important as the previous four I mentioned would be Sepultura. Again, their early albums was a very important step for extreme music, of blending thrash metal with forms of, again, either death metal, and I've seen people even consider the debut full-length album by Sepultura as, ideas of like proto-black metal. Regardless, Sepultura is a very important figure for this style of music, and while yes, they're very well known, and you could almost argue to an extent they belong in tier 1 in big thrash, I feel like the influences they have on the extreme side of things, they need to be included in tier 5. Morbid Saint and Demolition Hammer are considered thrash metal bands, but why did I include them in the extreme thrash category? Mainly because a lot of people I've noticed when they ever talk about these particular bands will call them thrash metal bands that are heavily influenced by death metal. That when you listen to some of the riffs and the pacing of these albums, yeah, there's a strong death metal influence in there that I don't think it's too far-fetched to consider, some of the portions in the albums you hear by these two bands as almost, again, death thrash to an extent. Looking at my notes, I realized I wrote down quite a handful of bands for this particular tier, so to kind of speed things up a bit, I'm going to go in rapid fire with some of these names that, again, you should all know. But if you want more death thrash, check out bands like Deceased, Macabre, Protector, Solstice, which is a really good Floridian death thrash band, Decapitator, which I know is the side project to that of Matt Harvey. Then you got Niflheim, which is such an ass-kicking band. Oh my god. If anyone is willing to sell me a copy of their debut full-length album on LP, I would be eternally grateful, because I've been forever searching for this album. I can't emphasize it enough. If you are a fan of black metal and thrash metal being put together, this is like the apex of that style just for its whole runtime. It is just so freaking good. And obviously, if I'm talking about bands that blend both black metal and thrash metal together, other noticeable names would be Aura Noir and Destroyer 666. Oh, and if I'm going to talk about Niflheim like that, I need to include Diabolic Night, which is a mixture of like black metal to an extent with forms of speed metal and thrash metal together, that it's basically you take the aggression of Niflheim and you mix it with the galloping like riffs of Running Wild, and it's just a match made in heaven for me. As for newer bands that have been blending both forms of extreme music and thrash metal together, one noticeable name that I see people bring up quite a bit is Midnight. And as they continuously release new albums on almost a yearly basis, I know they've been really consistent, they've just been gaining more and more recognition. And obviously, if I'm going to bring up Midnight, another band that's kind of doing the same thing in terms of style and influence, and again gaining quite a bit of recognition, at least particularly this year, would be Hellripper. Their latest album that I think was released back in this year of like February, I know it was like early 2023. Total burner, and it's a must listen for anyone who, again, enjoys styles of black metal and thrash metal blended together. Then there's Ghoul, which blends death metal and thrash metal together with some forms of grindcore. It's like a really thrashy death grind band that it takes like the antics of Gwar, especially when it comes to their live shows with like all the fake blood and shit they'll like throw at the audience, and it has like this whole kind of like gimmick with their themes all having to do with this made up place called like I think Creepsylvania, something like that. But really fun band to see live, and just their albums kind of match the energy and intensity you'll get if you were ever catch them live. Just overall, it's a really fun death thrash band. Capping off tier 5, gotta end it on a high note with two bands. One of them being a Japanese blackened thrash band, Abigail. Can't emphasize it enough. Listen to one song or just look at one of their album artworks and it's just perverse as it can get. Then you got Shitfucker, which, what more do I need to say with a band name like that? And speaking of which, actually I'll include at a last minute, Syphilitic Vaginas, which is a band that blends speed metal, hardcore punk, thrash, and to an extent black metal, and with their band name alone, heavily influenced by Gizm, as I'm pretty sure that's a song title for Gizm, and their font is influenced by Spinal Tap, so there's that influence as well. It's kind of just like a melting pot of just influences from either Spinal Tap or like the Japanese like extreme punk scene, just kind of like all mishmashed together. And I mean, it is fun, don't get me wrong, but it's always been like such an anomaly for me because of the influences and the presentation and just the mystery as to who the main man is behind this band. Regardless, if you just want very energetic, sleazy, alcohol drenched speed extreme thrash metal, definitely check out Syphilitic Vaginas. Alright, with that all out of the way, we move down the Iceberg chart another tier to tier number 6, which is complex thrash. These are all of the bands that take thrash metal obviously in a more complex direction with elements of progressive rock or a lot more technicality to it. Just overall, everything you're used to hearing with thrash metal, all of these bands kind of want to take that understanding and turn it on its head, basically. The most noticeable name that is pretty obvious that I'm going to bring up when it comes to the more of the technical and progressive side of thrash metal is, of course, Voivod, which huge pioneers for what is deemed as technical thrash metal, and everything they did, especially around like early 90s and late 80s, I really think kind of kept the interest and innovation sparking for thrash metal for years to come. Then there's Coronor, which I would say is very similar to that of Voivod, but they just add in more technicality, and it's not all like futuristic cybergenetic themed like Voivod. That, I mean, it's kind of obvious if you enjoy either Voivod or Coronor, you'll enjoy the other vice versa. But yeah, Coronor, if you want more of the technical side of things with thrash metal, this is like your go-to band. With both of those bands mentioned, I feel like I need to name immediately Vector, which over the past decade, this band received a lot of critical acclaim as it takes such heavy influence from these two, most specifically Voivod, again for that super futuristic cybergenetic approach that, yeah, if you want more again of the progressive side of thrash metal that kind of keeps the innovation going for the style of music, Vector is another must-know name. Watchtower is a progressive thrash metal band with elements of power metal kind of sprinkled in their songwriting. That I've always looked at them as they're basically what it would be like if Running Wild just added more complexity and more transitions with their songwriting. It would be very similar to that of what you would get with Watchtower. Thought Industry is a progressive thrash metal band that released a lot of their material in the early 90s. And I feel like it's really important to bring this up, or at least from what I've noticed, that again, a lot of people talk about thrash metal was in its heyday in the 80s. It just owned that decade. And the moment the 90s hit, it started fading away. And while, yeah, the bigger names kind of changed their style to more of a radio-friendly approach, I feel like there was still innovation happening in the underground scene. And Thought Industry is a perfect representation of that, as there's a lot to do with themes of surrealism and taking thrash metal in a much more abstract direction. The bass playing on some of their albums is really innovative and crazy sounding that almost has more of like a jazz influence with it. But I feel like if you want, thrash metal to give you this abstract, approach that you just really don't come across, definitely check out Thought Industry because they did some really creative stuff. Aspid was a Russian progressive technical thrash metal band that only did one full-length album, but good lord, this album is such a hidden gem in thrash metal. Arguably, I'd say this is the best written album in this tier because everything in terms of composition is just simply incredible, and it's a bummer that the individuals behind this band only did this one thing and then called it quits. But the ideas and riffs you will hear in this album, it's truly one of a kind and really another hidden gem in 90s thrash metal. Toxic, spelt with a K, is probably the most accessible, complex thrash band I will include, as where everything else has progression or technicality to make things a bit more abstract or really challenge the norms of what you will find in thrash metal. Toxic just takes technical thrash just full on to the aggression standpoint, and I feel like, again, if you want a good place to start with more of the complex styles of thrash metal, Toxic is the best place for it. Doom, the thrash metal band from Japan, not the crust punk band, is a progressive, thrash metal band with elements of avant-garde thrown in for good measure. That, again, like most of that I've talked about, it's more complex, there's a lot more transitions, a lot of abrupt changes with the sound, but the composition never feels lackluster. It's still really engaging and fun and energetic with all the sounds you would want in thrash metal. Again, if you just want to keep piling on all the weirdo, complex thrash metal in your playlist, definitely check out Doom. Then you have the band called Why. They were an Italian avant-garde thrash band that it's really hard to explain, and I hate to give like this really poor explanation that I feel like is kind of lackluster, but it's basically as if Mr. Bungle were to be a thrash band. That's what Why kind of gives off with their songwriting, and again, really different, like, again, anything else in this tier that I don't think I've ever seen anyone ever talk about, and it took a while for me to accidentally come across this over the past handful of weeks that I've been making this chart, but Why was quite the discovery, to say the least. Am Bogalard, which hopefully I'm saying that correctly, is another progressive thrash band that, again, like everything else, there's a lot of abrupt changes with the transitions. They'll have like these keyboard sections and spoken word parts, and then immediately hit you with like these really aggressive thrash sections that, again, I believe it was released in the 90s, and just like what I've talked about thus far, a lot of 90s thrash bands that were in the underground were really being a lot more experimental, and again, this is another great example of that. Sadly, this is the only full-length album they did, and from what I researched, one of the members ended up playing as, like, I think the guitarist for Marilyn Manson, so they just moved on to bigger things, but when they were active with this, they were experimenting quite a bit. That, again, if you want to test the waters of what you think thrash metal can really do, this is another great example of that. Second to last will be Hyeno Daisuke, hopefully saying that somewhat correctly, and this is a technical grindcore band with elements of thrash metal, and right from that description you would think, is this related to Discordance Axis and Gridlink? And yes, it actually is, as it has John Chang and the guitarist of Gridlink basically playing the same style of technical grindcore, but just way more with this thrash influence. That is just a wild ride for just 12 minutes. And if you ever wondered what that combination sounds like if you were to put these styles in a blender, this is the end results, and it's wild. I can't stress that enough. And the final inclusion for Tier 6 will be easily the wildest one, that being the band Bad Acid Trip with their album For the Weird, By the Weird. I know, how fitting. This is like a mixture of thrash metal, obviously, with grindcore and just a lot of experimentation that it's really hard to wonder where the influence came from, where these ideas kind of mingle together between each track, and it's just a really absurd album. I don't know how else to describe it. It's almost like it's just an album, especially by the album title, that you just kind of get lost in the weird nature of just everything. And there's really not much else to say other than, yeah, it's weird. With all of that, we have now reached the bottom of the Iceberg chart to Tier 7, which is just simply lo-fi thrash. Prior to making this video, it was really difficult for me to think of or find anything that would fit the bottom of a thrash metal Iceberg chart, mainly because everything I just listed in Tier 6 of like the complex stuff is usually where people say that's it. That's where thrash metal kind of draws the line. Because anything past that, you start getting into like, you know, different territory of subgenres. And it's rare to come by thrash bands that experiment in this like noisy kind of way, or any thrash band that would be a mixture between like power electronics and thrash metal. Like that just non-existent. I tried so hard to find it, and that doesn't exist. However, it took a bit of research and going down some rabbit holes, but everything that's listed in this tier, which there's only I think maybe 4 or 5 that I wrote down in my notes, they're all kind of like these obscure, forgotten thrash bands, if you even want to call it that have like all these demos that are just really lo-fi and raw sounding, that even though it's harsh and brittle and you might think, oh, there's elements of black metal in it, you can still clearly hear like the thrash metal guitar riffs that make this genre what it is being played out. And I feel like all these bands perfectly kind of represent what I was trying to find for what would be suitable for the bottom of a thrash metal Iceberg chart. One of the 5 bands I included in this tier is going to be a band called 666. This was a one-man like thrash metal band from the Czech Republic with elements of black metal. I think this is from like 1983 or 82 from what I researched. Some people consider it to be like one of these long lost, forgotten first real black metal bands from the Czech Republic. Regardless, this one demo that he released is just, as you would imagine, demo quality, and it's really harsh and lo-fi, and I really don't know what else to say other than this is like a good representation of what basically everything I'm going to discuss in this tier is going to be. It's just demo quality, long lost, forgotten, and harsh thrash metal. And it's only going to get more difficult to listen to as I proceed on. Angel Reaper was a Hungarian thrash metal band, very similar to that of 666, as it had styles of like black metal kinda in that first wave sense, but there's a lot of like, I would say almost oi punk with how the riffs are played out. Again, still thrash metal is something you can make out mostly, and it's just more difficult to listen to than 666 as it's just longer and the discography is slightly larger, I think with like 2 or 3 demos. And yeah, not much else to say other than that. Evoked Doom was a German speed thrash band that released a demo back in 1986. The drums are not really well mixed. Vocally and guitar-wise, resembles a lot again of speed metal and thrash metal. But as you could imagine, as everything else I've talked about thus far, it's really harsh and difficult to listen to. And let's just move on to the next one. Semen of Satan was a German thrash band that released a demo back in 1984. And it's not so much the name that's making me laugh. Okay, it is, but it's also just like the music is just really rough around the edges. I can't emphasize that enough. I get that it's a demo, but everything's really not in sync, and lo-fi, and that's all I can say about it. And the final band for Tier 7 and closing out this Iceberg chart is going to be Sadist. And the reason why I kind of saved them last is not for any random reason, but this is probably the most fierce and ferocious in this tier because it's like it has thrash metal, an idea of like maybe death metal to an extent, and forms of grindcore, and they're just playing everything just so viciously and rapid that it just sounds kind of like noise to me. And I don't know, it was just like, I don't know why I found myself laughing at it, just because of like how just ridiculous everything kind of came off. Like they just I don't know, I feel like they missed the mark of what they were trying to do, but still made it like entertaining. And I don't know, I really don't know what else to say, just other than it's I'm basically just repeating adjectives, but yeah, lo-fi, harsh, difficult to listen to. You get the gist at this point. And that'll do it for this Iceberg chart video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. And yeah, other than that, make sure, like always guys, you guys drink plenty of water to stay hydrated, and have a great day.